Divine Capital Management wasn't your typical hedge fund. Morning prayers before market opening, confession booths in the trading floor, investment strategies guided by scripture. CEO Jonathan Hartwell was a born-again billionaire who claimed God spoke to him through cryptocurrency and proved it with impossible returns. His fund's performance was miraculous, 300% annual returns for 7 straight years, never a losing quarter, never a wrong prediction. The secret was Heaven Coin, a cryptocurrency that responded to prayer, algorithms that interpreted divine will, and blockchain technology blessed by angels. Morrison's client list read like a religious directory. Megachurch pastors with private jets and prosperity preachers with Ponzi schemes. But secular investors like teachers and firefighters wanted in. Think university endowments and retirement accounts for millions. The fund's methods were unorthodox. Investment decisions through prayer, portfolio allocation via prophecy, and risk management through revelation. Morrison claimed direct communication. God told me to short Tesla. The Holy Spirit revealed Bitcoin's peak. Jesus showed me the next recession. Heaven Coin became the world's most valuable cryptocurrency, trading at $100,000 per coin, backed by divine guarantee and insured by heavenly intervention. The fund's success spawned imitators, Buddhist trading algorithms, Islamic finance protocols, Hindu investment strategies. Wall Street became a religious battlefield with gods competing for market share. Prophets programming prophets. Faith trading against faith until the prayers stopped working. Before we get started, each of our episodes is original and uniquely crafted to ensure you never get bored. We've launched this show with a focus on sharp, original storytelling. And as more viewers join us, you'll see everything level up. Visuals, sound design, pacing, and production quality. The bigger the audience, the bolder the stories we can tell. So if you want to support us and continue seeing more episodes, subscribe and turn on the notification bell now. You're about to enter a world where money isn't just power. It's the most powerful motive. What if I told you I could guarantee you returns of 30% per month? The words hit the packed conference room at the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Manhattan like a lightning bolt. Hedge fund managers shifted in their leather chairs. Investment bankers with million-dollar watches exchanged nervous glances. Venture capitalists in their perfectly pressed suits leaned forward like hungry wolves. Jonathan Hartwell stood at the front of the room like a man who owned the world. His bright blue eyes scanned the faces of some of Wall Street's most powerful money people. At 35, he looked like every successful tech guy you've ever seen. An expensive navy suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, perfectly styled brown hair, and a smile that could sell ice to polar bears. This was his moment, his call to adventure. The moment he would cross the threshold from small-time religious con artist to big-league financial criminal. What if I told you I had found a way to predict crypto markets with 97% accuracy? He continued, his voice carrying easily across the marble-floored room with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. The silence was deafening. These weren't naive investors. These were people who had seen every scam and trick in the book. But something about Hartwell made them want to listen. He possessed what every great villain needs, charisma that could make people ignore their better judgment. "I know what you're thinking," Hartwell said, with a knowing smile that showed perfect white teeth. "You're thinking this sounds too good to be true. You're thinking this is another scam. But I'm here to tell you that you're wrong." He clicked a button on his silver laptop, and the massive screen behind him exploded with charts and graphs that made everyone's breath catch, green lines shooting upward month after month, profit margins that seemed to defy gravity, numbers that would make even the greediest Wall Street veteran dizzy with excitement. These charts were Hartwell's magic weapon, his special power that separated him from ordinary criminals. He had learned that the right lie, told with enough confidence and backed by impressive visuals, could make even smart people stupid. Divine Digital Assets has been running for 3 years, Hartwell explained, pointing to the screen with a laser pointer. We've never had a losing quarter. We've never had a losing month. In fact, we've only had 7 losing days in our entire history. The room erupted in whispered conversations. Phones buzzed as people started texting their assistants. Sarah Martinez from BlackRock, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s known for asking the toughest questions on Wall Street, raised her perfectly manicured hand. "How?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the chatter like a knife. This was the test, the moment every villain faces when their story might crumble. But Hartwell was ready. "I'm glad you asked, Sarah. The answer is simple, but it's also revolutionary. We don't just look at market data. We study human behavior. We look at the patterns of fear and greed that drive every single trade in the crypto markets." He clicked to the next slide, revealing a complex diagram that looked like something from a psychology textbook mixed with a computer science manual. Colorful charts showed brain scans, emotion maps, and trading patterns, all connected by flowing arrows. "Our special computer program doesn't just analyze price movements," he continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, forcing everyone to lean in. "It studies social media posts, news articles, forum discussions, even the facial expressions of major crypto influencers during their video streams." The room was completely silent now. Even the traffic noise from the street below seemed to fade away. "But here's the really amazing part," Hartwell said, pausing for dramatic effect. "We've discovered that human behavior in financial markets follows the same patterns as human behavior in religious communities. The same psychological triggers that create faith also drive predictable decision-making patterns in trading." He let that sink in, watching as the implications dawned on his audience, like sunrise breaking over the Manhattan skyline. This was his master stroke, using his real expertise in religious manipulation to create a believable lie about financial markets. We've basically created a system that can predict market movements by understanding the spiritual and emotional states of the people who drive those markets. We're not just trading crypto, we're trading human nature itself. Questions started flying from every corner of the room like bullets from a machine gun. How did the algorithm work? What kind of data did they collect? How could they guarantee such consistent returns? Hartwell fielded each question with the confidence of a man who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. Marcus Goldman from Deutsche Bank raised his hand, his thick German accent cutting through the excitement. "What about regulatory compliance?" "The SEC has been cracking down on crypto investments." Hartwell's smile grew wider. "Excellent question, Marcus. We work closely with some of the best compliance attorneys in the country. Every single trade we make is fully documented and reported. We're actually more transparent than most traditional hedge funds." It was a complete lie, but delivered with such confidence that even the skeptics in the room began to nod their heads. "And what about liquidity?" asked Jennifer Walsh from JP Morgan, her voice sharp with professional curiosity. "If we invest significant funds, how quickly can we access our returns?" "Our standard withdrawal policy allows for partial liquidation with 30 days' notice, full liquidation with 90 days, Hartwell replied smoothly. "Though, I should mention that our most successful clients tend to reinvest their profits rather than withdrawing them. The compound growth potential is simply too attractive to ignore." This was another carefully constructed lie. There was no liquidity because there were no real profits to withdraw, but the 90-day clause would give him time to shuffle money around and create the illusion of payment if anyone tried to pull out. By the time he clicked to his final slide, contact information and minimum investment requirements, half the room was ready to write checks immediately. The other half was curious enough to want a private meeting. The minimum investment was set at $5 million for institutional investors, $50 million for pension funds. These weren't small numbers, but for the people in this room, they represented calculated risks rather than life-changing sums. "I'll be staying in the city for the next week," Hartwell announced as the presentation concluded. "My team and I are available for individual meetings to discuss specific investment strategies. We're not looking for hundreds of clients. We're looking for the right clients, partners who understand that revolutionary opportunities require revolutionary thinking." As the crowd began to disperse, Hartwell was immediately surrounded by interested investors. Business cards were exchanged like ammunition in a war zone. Calendar apps buzzed with meeting requests. The hook had been set, and the fish were biting harder than he had ever dreamed possible. It was exactly what Hartwell had hoped for. But what none of them knew was that they had just met a villain who was about to take them on the most expensive journey of their lives. But to understand how Jonathan Hartwell became the villain of this story, we need to go back to where it all began. 6 months earlier, in a place that would make Wall Street executives run screaming. The warehouse in Queens looked like it had been forgotten by the world. Broken windows covered with newspaper, graffiti-covered brick walls, weeds growing through cracks in the concrete. But inside, it was completely different and completely terrifying. Dozens of people sat in neat rows of metal folding chairs, all facing a simple wooden stage where Jonathan Hartwell stood behind a beat-up podium. Harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a cold, clinical glow that made everyone look like ghosts. This was Hartwell's ordinary world, the place where he had first learned that faith could be weaponized, where he discovered that desperate people would believe anything if you told them God wanted them to. But this wasn't the same Jonathan Hartwell who had impressed Wall Street's elite. Gone was the expensive suit and polished look. Instead, he wore flowing white robes and spoke like a man who believed God had chosen him personally for a special mission. "My brothers and sisters," he began, his voice echoing through the cavernous space like thunder. "We are living in the end times. The old money system is crumbling, governments are failing, and the only way to survive what's coming is to prepare ourselves spiritually and financially." The crowd murmured in agreement. These weren't the wealthy investors from the fancy hotel. These were his first victims, teachers with tired eyes, construction workers with calloused hands, nurses still wearing their scrubs from the night shift, small business owners struggling to make ends meet, people who were working 2 jobs and desperately wanted to believe that someone had the answers. In the front row sat Rebecca Stone, a brilliant computer programmer in her late 20s with short black hair and intense green eyes. She had joined Hartwell's community after losing her job at a tech startup, desperate for both purpose and income. She would become his most valuable ally, and eventually, the key to his downfall. Next to her sat Maria Santos, a single mother in her 30s whose husband had died in a construction accident, leaving her with mountains of medical debt and a daughter who dreamed of going to college. Behind them was Carlos Rivera, a hard-working immigrant who sent half his paycheck to his family in El Salvador and was looking for a way to build a better future for his children. These were the forgotten people of America, the ones who got up every morning and worked honest jobs for honest pay, but could never seem to get ahead. They were the perfect targets for Hartwell's scheme because they combined 2 dangerous qualities: desperation and faith. "But God has given us a gift," Hartwell continued, his voice rising with passion that seemed to fill every corner of the warehouse. "He has shown us the path to financial freedom, and through that freedom, we can reach spiritual enlightenment. The Divine Digital Assets Platform isn't just a trading system. It's a tool for God's work." This was the moment Hartwell crossed the threshold from ordinary con artist to something much more dangerous. He had discovered that by mixing religion with finance, he could create a weapon more powerful than any gun. He pointed to a large screen behind him, which showed the same impressive charts he would later show to the Wall Street crowd. But here, in this warehouse that smelled of old concrete and broken dreams, he told a very different story about what those numbers meant. Every dollar we earn through our trading platform is a dollar we can use to spread God's word, he explained, his blue eyes blazing with conviction that seemed genuine, even though it was completely fake. Every profit we make is a blessing that lets us help more people find salvation. This isn't about getting rich. This is about building God's kingdom on earth. The crowd was totally captivated. They had been following Hartwell for years, watching him evolve from a struggling preacher to someone who claimed to talk directly with God. They trusted him completely, which made them the perfect test subjects for his scheme. Hartwell had spent months perfecting his presentation for this audience. He knew that these people didn't care about technical analysis or market algorithms. They cared about hope, about the promise that their suffering had meaning and that better days were coming. "I need your help," Hartwell continued, his voice dropping to a more personal tone that made everyone lean forward. "The work we're doing requires sacrifice. It requires faith. And yes, it requires money. I'm asking each of you to consider investing in our platform, not for your own gain, but for the greater good of our community." This was the birth of his master plan. Take the same scam, but tell it two different ways to two different audiences. To religious people, it was about serving God. To Wall Street people, it was about making money. Both groups would give him their cash, but for completely different reasons. Over the next hour, Hartwell showed videos of families who had supposedly made huge profits through the platform. Stories of people paying off mortgages, sending kids to college, escaping poverty, all thanks to their faith in divine digital assets. The videos were professionally produced and emotionally devastating. A young couple with tears in their eyes, talking about how they had been able to buy their first home thanks to their investment returns. An elderly man describing how he had been able to pay for his wife's cancer treatment. A single mother explaining how she had saved enough money to send her son to medical school. What he didn't mention was that every single story was fake. The families in the videos were paid actors recruited from community theater groups and acting classes. The profit statements were made up on Rebecca's computer. The entire presentation was an elaborate lie designed to convince desperate people to hand over their life savings. But the audience didn't know that. They saw hope where there had been none. They saw a path forward when they had felt trapped. They saw a chance to transform their lives and serve God at the same time. "The minimum investment is just $500, Hartwell announced, his voice filled with warmth and understanding. "I know that's a lot of money for many of you. I know some of you are living paycheck to paycheck, but think of it as a seed that will grow into a tree that provides fruit for generations." The religious metaphors were carefully chosen. These people had been raised on stories of mustard seeds and loaves and fishes. They understood that sometimes great things came from small sacrifices. By the end of the evening, Hartwell had collected over $200,000 in new investments from people who could barely afford to lose $20. But more importantly, he had proven that his system worked. The investment forms were designed to look official and reassuring. They included disclaimers about risk and volatility, legal language that most people didn't understand, and promises of regular statements and updates. Everything needed to create the illusion of legitimacy. As the crowd left the warehouse, clutching investment forms and feeling hopeful about their financial future for the first time in years, Hartwell went to a small office in the back of the building. There, surrounded by humming computer monitors and stacks of financial documents, he made a decision that would change everything. He was going to take this show to Wall Street. 3 floors below a community center in Astoria, Rebecca Stone was about to become both the hero and victim of her own story. The basement buzzed with activity that would have made NASA jealous. Dozens of computer screens glowed in the darkness like digital campfires, each showing complex spreadsheets and financial transactions that danced across the monitors in endless streams of numbers. Rebecca was Hartwell's secret weapon, a brilliant programmer who could make numbers dance and money disappear. But she was also the one person who could bring him down if she ever realized what she was really doing. The basement operation was Rebecca's masterpiece, a technical infrastructure that could have powered a legitimate tech startup. Servers hummed in climate-controlled racks, fiber optic cables snaked across the ceilings like digital ivy, and multiple internet connections ensured that the operation never went offline. "How are we looking at the Goldman Sachs account?" she asked David Kim, a former MIT computer science student who had joined the community after dropping out of school. His thick black-rimmed glasses reflected the glow of his monitors as his fingers flew across the keyboard like a concert pianist. "All good," David replied without looking up. "Their monthly statement shows a 12% return, right on schedule. They're totally buying it." Rebecca smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who knew she was walking on thin ice over deep water. She had become the architect of something that was either brilliant or completely evil, and she wasn't entirely sure which. The Goldman Sachs investment was their biggest test. These weren't naive religious followers. They were smart investors with teams of lawyers and forensic accountants who would start asking serious questions if anything seemed wrong. That's why Rebecca had spent months creating what she called the money machine, a complex web of fake companies, crypto exchanges, and international bank accounts that made it almost impossible to trace where the money was actually going. The system was a work of art in its complexity. Rebecca had created over 40 shell companies registered in countries like the Cayman Islands, Cyprus, and Malta. Each company had its own bank accounts, its own cryptocurrency wallets, and its own supposed business activities. On paper, they formed a legitimate ecosystem of trading, consulting, and technology services. Here's how the magic trick worked. When wealthy investors like Goldman Sachs put money into the Divine Digital Assets platform, the money would immediately be chopped up into dozens of smaller pieces, like a puzzle being scattered. Some would be sent to real crypto exchanges, where it would be used to make small, safe trades that made modest profits. But most of the money would disappear into a maze of fake companies that Rebecca had set up in countries with weak financial laws. From there, it would be turned into various cryptocurrencies, bounced between different exchanges like a pinball, and eventually end up in accounts controlled by Hartwell and his inner circle. The genius of the system was that it made just enough real profits to make the fake profits seem believable. When Goldman Sachs got their monthly statement showing a 12% return, about 3% was actually real, made by legitimate T-rating activities. The other 9% was simply money that had been stolen from other investors and shuffled around to create the illusion of success. Rebecca had also created an impressive client portal that allowed investors to log in and check their account balances at any time. The portal showed detailed transaction histories, market analysis reports, and performance charts that would impress even the most sophisticated investors. But it was all fake. The transaction histories were generated by algorithms that Rebecca had programmed to create realistic-looking trading patterns. The market analysis reports were written by artificial intelligence trained on real financial documents. The performance charts showed fictional gains that existed only in the computer's memory. "What about the community accounts?" Rebecca asked, referring to the investments made by Hartwell's religious followers. "Those are getting tricky," David admitted, finally looking up from his screen. His young face looked tired and worried. "We've got about 350 individual accounts, totaling around $2 million. Some of them are starting to ask questions about why they can't withdraw their profits." This was Rebecca's first glimpse of the monster she had helped create. The wealthy Wall Street investors were easy to manage. They were used to having their money locked up in long-term investments. But the religious community members were different. Many had invested their entire life savings, and they expected to be able to access their profits to pay for things like medical bills and house payments. When they discovered their money was basically trapped in the system, they started to panic, and panicked investors asked uncomfortable questions. "Maria Santos called again today," David continued, scrolling through a list of customer service requests. "She wants to withdraw $5,000 to pay for her daughter's school tuition. I told her there was a temporary liquidity issue, but she's getting suspicious." Rebecca felt a stab of guilt. She knew Maria personally, had sat next to her during Hartwell's presentations, had heard her story about struggling to raise her daughter alone. The idea that Maria was now in financial trouble because of something Rebecca had built made her stomach turn. "We need to give them something," Rebecca said, rubbing her tired eyes. "Maybe we can process some small withdrawals just to keep them happy." "That's going to hurt our margins," David warned. "We're already running pretty thin trying to keep up with all the fake returns." Rebecca was facing what every hero faces in their journey, the first major test that reveals the true nature of their quest. She could either find a way to keep the lie going, or she could admit that they were running a criminal enterprise that was destroying people's lives. The technical challenges of running the fraud were becoming increasingly complex. Rebecca had to maintain dozens of fake trading accounts, generate thousands of fictional transactions, and create believable financial statements for investors who ranged from sophisticated Wall Street firms to individual retirees. She had written custom software that could automatically generate trading reports in multiple formats, create fake audit documents, and even produce fabricated regulatory filings. The system was so sophisticated that it could probably have been sold as a legitimate financial technology platform. But maintaining the illusion required constant work. Rebecca often worked 18-hour days, tweaking algorithms, updating fake transactions, and responding to investor inquiries. She had become a prisoner of her own creation, trapped in a web of lies that grew more complex every day. She chose to keep the lie going, but that choice would come back to haunt her in ways she couldn't imagine. Meanwhile, 3 floors above them, Hartwell was hosting another investment meeting, this time with pension fund managers from California. He stood at the front of another fancy conference room, showing the same impressive charts, telling the same story about revolutionary computer programs and guaranteed returns. The pension fund managers were interested, very interested. They were talking about an investment of over $100 million, which would be by far the largest single investment in the history of Divine Digital Assets. But what Hartwell didn't know was that one of the managers in the room had already started digging into the company's background. And what he had discovered was going to turn Rebecca from an ally into something much more dangerous, a witness to the truth. Robert Chen was about to become the hero this story desperately needed, but he didn't know it yet. Robert had been managing pension funds for 23 years, and in that time, he had learned to trust his gut like a detective trusts evidence. And right now, every instinct he had was screaming that something was very wrong with Divine Digital Assets. This was his call to adventure, the moment when an ordinary person decides to do something extraordinary. Robert could have just passed on the investment and moved on with his life. Instead, he chose to dig deeper. It started with a simple Google search. After attending Hartwell's presentation the week before, Robert went back to his office in San Francisco and decided to do some basic detective work on the company. What he found, or rather, what he didn't find, immediately raised more red flags than a communist parade. For a company that claimed to have been operating for 3 years and managing hundreds of millions of dollars, Divine Digital Assets had a surprisingly small online footprint. Their website looked professional, but contained very little specific information. Their social media presence was minimal, and there were no news articles about their supposed success. But it was the legal paperwork that really caught Robert's attention. According to the documents he found, Divine Digital Assets had been registered as a company in Delaware. just 18 months earlier. Not 3 years, as Hartwell had claimed. Robert had seen this pattern before. It was the same setup used by countless financial scams and pyramid schemes. Like a bloodhound picking up a scent, he decided to dig deeper. His first call was to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Robert had contacts at the SEC from his years in the industry, and he asked them to run a background check on Jonathan Hartwell and Divine Digital Assets. What they found was disturbing. Hartwell had no background in finance or technology. His previous experience was entirely in religious ministry, including running a small church in Arizona that had been shut down by state authorities for financial problems. This was Robert's first major discovery, the revelation that transforms a hero's understanding of their quest. Hartwell wasn't a tech genius with a revolutionary trading algorithm. He was a failed preacher with a history of taking money from religious communities. But Robert's most shocking discovery came when he decided to investigate the company's claimed trading activities. Using his industry connections, he was able to access trading records from several major crypto exchanges. If Divine Digital Assets was really making the massive profits they claimed, there should be evidence of large-scale trading activity on these platforms. What he found was almost nothing. There were a few small trades here and there, but nothing that would justify the hundreds of millions of dollars the company claimed to be managing. The math simply didn't add up. According to Hartwell's presentations, Divine Digital Assets was executing thousands of trades per month across multiple cryptocurrency exchanges. But when Robert looked at the actual trading data, he found only a handful of small transactions that wouldn't have generated more than a few $1,000s in profits. Robert realized he was looking at one of the most sophisticated financial frauds he had ever encountered. Hartwell had managed to convince some of the smartest people in the financial industry to invest in a company that was basically a complete fake. But Robert's investigation also revealed something else that made the situation even more dangerous. According to the bank records he was able to access, Divine Digital Assets wasn't just taking money from wealthy investors. They were also collecting funds from hundreds of individual investors, many of whom appeared to be making relatively small investments that probably represented their entire life savings. Robert spent the next week making phone calls and following paper trails. He contacted other pension fund managers who had attended Hartwell's presentations, checked with regulatory databases, and even hired a private investigator to look into Hartwell's background. What emerged was a picture of a man who had spent his entire adult life taking money from vulnerable people. The church in Arizona had been shut down after complaints that Hartwell was pressuring elderly parishioners to donate their Social Security checks. Before that, he had run a Christian financial planning service that had been investigated for fraud, but never prosecuted. The pattern was always the same. Hartwell would target people who were desperate for hope, promise them that God had a special plan for their financial future, and then convince them to hand over their money. The only difference this time was the scale of his ambition. This wasn't just a case of some Wall Street firms losing money on a bad investment. This was a scheme that was destroying the financial lives of ordinary people who had trusted Hartwell with everything they had. Robert knew he had crossed the threshold into dangerous territory. Every day that passed meant more people were being victimized and more money was disappearing into Hartwell's pockets. He immediately contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force and arranged to meet with agents who specialized in investment fraud. The FBI was initially skeptical. Financial fraud cases were notoriously difficult to prove, especially when they involved sophisticated investors who should have known better. But when Robert showed them the evidence he had gathered, they realized they were looking at something much bigger than a simple investment scam. Special Agent Sarah Martinez was assigned to lead the investigation. She had spent 15 years investigating financial crimes, from penny stock scams to complex money laundering operations. But she had never seen anything quite like this, a fraud that combined religious manipulation with sophisticated financial technology. The problem with this type of scheme, Agent Martinez explained to Robert during their first meeting, is that the perpetrator is essentially running two different cons simultaneously. He's telling one story to sophisticated investors and a completely different story to vulnerable individuals. It makes the case much more complex to prosecute. This was Robert's commitment to the journey, the point where a hero decides to see their quest through to the end, no matter the cost. He could have just reported his findings and walked away. Instead, he chose to become the key witness in bringing down one of the most sophisticated financial frauds in American history. The race was on. Robert and the federal investigators had to move fast to shut down the scheme before even more people lost their money. But Hartwell had spent years perfecting his operation, and he wasn't going to go down without a fight. Agent Martinez began building a case that would require months of investigation, dozens of interviews, and careful coordination with international law enforcement agencies. The complexity of Rebecca's money laundering system meant that tracing the stolen funds would be like untangling a spider web made of digital transactions and offshore bank accounts. But Robert had given them the key to the puzzle, the realization that Divine Digital Assets was not a legitimate investment company, but an elaborate criminal enterprise designed to steal money from anyone foolish enough to trust Jonathan Hartwell. The investigation was about to begin in earnest, and nothing would ever be the same for anyone involved in the scheme.